the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to talk about a subject that's called Zugzwang, which is a German word for a situation, a unique situation, when you wish you wouldn't have to move. Unlike in other games, such as card games, in chess you do not have the option to say you pass and you do not make a move, and you give your turn over to your opponent. You cannot do that in chess. And in these special situations, when you have to make a move, and with that ruin your own position, that's what's called Zugzwang. Let's go and see some basic examples and then move on to some more complex ones. The following pawn endgame is a very basic one, and the only reason why Black is losing this game because he has to move and he has to leave blockading the promotion square of the white pawn on d7. Black's only legal move is to move the king out, and then the white king succeeds to get to e7, helping the pawn to promote to a queen on the following move, and then of course king and queen is an easy win against a lone king. Let's move on to a bit trickier situation. This is also a pawn endgame, however both sides have pawns. This is one of those situations that's called mutual Zugzwang. What that means is that each side, both sides, wish they wouldn't have to move. That is, if it's Black to move, Black is losing the pawn on e5 because the king can only move to a square that no longer protects the pawn on e5. And if it is White to move, then the white king needs to leave the protection of the pawn on e4. Therefore, the side that has to move is losing. Let's see another pawn endgame that has a few more pawns in the position. In this situation, if it is White's turn, White will play g5 and put Black in so-called Zugzwang. As you can see, the Black pawns on g6, e4 and a6 cannot move at all, while if the Black king moves, then White can capture the pawn on e4. Of course, the same goes if the Black king moves backwards, White would still capture the pawn and then slowly but surely advance the d-pawn and win the endgame. It would also not help Black if Black would push the pawn up to b5, as long, of course, as your opponent would be aware of the en passant rule and simply capture that pawn with a special en passant rule, and then Black would be stuck again with the same problem, being in Zugzwang, needing to move the king and then lose the pawn on e4 as well. If we go back to the starting position and we would imagine that it's Black's turn, then Black would have a winning move, putting White into Zugzwang, Black himself playing g5 instead of White, and then White has the same problem, needing to move the king and then give up the pawn on d4, and Black would be winning. Zugzwang is a very special element, especially when it comes to endgames, and moreover, especially in pawn endgames. It's a very, very common theme, and you have to be completely aware of it and be careful of it. The next position I'm going to show you is a very famous position that was composed by a famous composer, and in this position, White has a brilliant move to win the game. In fact, White can force checkmate in just 2 moves. Of course, only if they find the correct move. I'll give you a couple of seconds before I'll continue with the answer. Try to figure out the solution. Of course, you on your end can pause the DVD at any time, and you can come back to see the solution after you think you're ready with the answer. And the answer is, if you're ready, it is rook to h6. It's one of those moves that has no threat. Nevertheless, it paralyzes black. It prevents the black pawn from h7 to move up to h6. And as we said, black has to make a move. Black cannot just say, I pass, it's your turn again. And after black moves the bishop, then white is ready to checkmate with rook takes h7. And of course, if the pawn captures the rook on h6, then the beautiful checkmate on g7 to the black king. A very beautiful example of Zugzwang. And now let's move on to some even trickier examples. In this rook endgame, white has an extra pawn. However, it seems that the g6 pawn will be traded in the very near future against black's f7 pawn, whether white captures now or white makes a different move and then black captures that white pawn. And then, since the black king is right near there, stopping the white pawn's advancement, the game typically would end in a draw. However, white here has a very special combination, and thanks to a Zugzwang idea, white can win. Again, I suggest you take your time, and it may be 5, 10, or even 15 minutes that you give it a try and try your best to find out what should be the correct move here. And when you're ready, come back, and here is the solution. White, imagine, can sacrifice a full rook by moving the rook to e8. Quite an amazing move. Of course, black better takes, because after king g7, white could simply remove the guard of the rook and play f6, deflect the king, and then simply capture the rook in the corner. However, naturally, with each combination, the test is, what if they accept the sacrifice? And let's see what happens now. White would advance the pawn. The black rook needs to remain on the 8th rank, otherwise the pawn just promotes. And now simply white connects the two pawns, and again white has no immediate threat in this position. However, black is in Zugzwang and cannot save the game. The best move to drag the game the longest is to play rook f8, but then white captures, promotes the pawn to a queen, and then more Zugzwangs are occurring. After king d7, again, if black wouldn't need to move, could stay where they are, the game would be a draw. But the king needs to move, the only legal move being moving to g8, and then the king again moving closer to the black pawn, and now finally the black king needs to leave the pawn, king takes, and then the win is simple. Simply king moves out of the pawn's way, and then the following two moves the pawn just promotes. A beautiful endgame, composed by Kryuchkov. Let's see the next endgame. That's a very nice one as well. Here we go, and this looks like a simple queen endgame, and most queen endgames with no material advantage are typically a draw. In fact, in this position, it is black who is ahead. Black has an extra pawn. It's true they are doubled, but nevertheless, it's an extra one. This is a composition by the famous composer Kuba. And amazingly, By the way, this is only the end of an endgame, so it's really hard to find it from all the way from the beginning. It's not so simple even from this stage. But in this position, white has a special move that has no threat, and yet black is in Zugzwang. Again, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out that special move that results in Zugzwang and gives white the win. And when you're ready, the solution is queen simply moving back to d3. Now, let's look carefully what are black's choices. If the king would move to the a file, whether to a4 or a5, the answer would be the same. Checkmate immediately with queen a3. If instead the black queen moves to some random square like e8, then white could checkmate in two moves by forcing the black king to the a file, just like in the previous variation, and then after king a4, give checkmate the same way. But let's see what happens if after queen d3 in this starting position, black tries to hang on to either the c3 or a3 squares. After queen c1, white has a very nice way to win the black queen by giving a check on a3. The black king has only one choice, moving to c4, and then b3. Discover check, winning the black queen. On the other hand, if after the first move, queen d3, black responds with queen a1, preventing the queen a3 check, then the same story from the other side, queen c3, forcing the king to a4, and again b3 discovery, winning the black queen and the game. Let's move on to the next position, which is a bit easier, I would say. And this is also a nice endgame, and it's one of those that seems a complete draw. Each side has only a bishop. In fact, they are opposite colored bishops, which typically is even easier draw, and each side has only one single pawn. The reason why such endgames typically are a very simple draw, because black can afford to give up their bishop and even their pawn just for white's last pawn on g4. Yet, in this particular case, it's not so simple to accomplish that. In fact, if white plays correctly, it's impossible to accomplish that. Needless to say, if the black bishop would not be so misplaced as it is on g8, but it would be pretty much anywhere else on the board, the game would be a very easy draw. However, because of the unfortunate positioning of the black bishop on g8, white can win. Again, I suggest you try to figure out the solution first on your own before you listen further and look at the solution. White to move needs to make sure the black pawn doesn't get advanced, because as we said, black doesn't mind to give up the pawn as long as the bishop gets rescued. Therefore, the first correct move is king to f6, preventing the advancement of the pawn and also preventing the activization of the black bishop by bishop h7, because that all of a sudden would allow a checkmate immediately with bishop e3. So after king f6, black's only other move is moving the king back to h7. Again, as you can see, black is being stuck move after move. White advances the pawn to g5, not giving black again any other choice but moving the king to the corner. And now a very important move by playing bishop to d4. And now the black bishop again cannot safely move to h7, because that would allow king takes pawn checkmate. So black had to play king h7, and now comes the amazing part that white can simply make a evading move along the long diagonal, pretty much on anywhere along those dark squares, and black sadly is in Zugzwang. If black wouldn't need to move, white could make no progress. However, black is forced to move, and the only legal move that black can make is to retreat the king to the corner. And that already allows white to advance the g-pawn, and when pawn takes, king takes pawn, checkmate. What a jewel, what a beautiful position. Let's move on to our next example, which is another pawn endgame, and a very famous one at it. It's one of the early endgame studies back from the 18th century, composed by Ponziani. It is, by the way, a very important endgame idea that I suggest that you remember. In situations when the one side, in this case black, is stuck because the black king is in Zugzwang, if the black king would move towards the h-file, the f-pawn would advance, or if the black king would move to the f-file, the h-pawn would advance. So all white needs to do is make sure the black king will need to move. However, if you look carefully, you'll notice that black has 3 connected pass pawns on the other side of the board. Shouldn't be black who is winning here? Well, that's certainly the case if white does not play accurately. However, if white finds the only correct move, white can win because the black pawns will run out of moves, and then at the end of the day, the black king will need to move, allowing either white's f or h pawns to become a queen. White has here 3 legal moves with the king at his disposal, moving to b2, b1, or a2. Only one of them win, the other ones actually lose. Try to remember this idea that when the 3 black, or sometimes white of course in a reversed case, 3 black pawns in this case are on the 4th rank, the correct move is, the winning move is, moving the king to b1. And that is in order to be in the middle. So if black pushes any of the pawns, the white king would want to step right under them. For example, if black pushes the middle pawn, you would want to move right under it. And it's not hard to get convinced that now if black pushes the pawn, king just takes, black pushes the pawn, and white simply collects all those pawns, and at the end of the day, black will be forced to move his king, and the white pawn will be unstoppable. Let's go back again to the starting position, and after king b1, if black plays c3, what would you move? Yes, of course, the king would move under the pawn to c2, followed by a3, king b3, and again, black will lose those pawns sooner or later, or will have to move the king. For example, after c2, king takes, a2, king b2, b3. Now, of course, white cannot take that pawn on b3 because that would allow the black pawn to promote, but simply makes a waiting move, and then black is in Zugzwang. You got it right. And last but not least, after king b1, if black chooses to push the a pawn, you know the deal. The king needs to move under that pawn, followed by c3 and king b3, and black again is helpless. Let's see another very cute pawn endgame. Here we are. Again, typically speaking, when one side in pawn endgames has an extra pawn, or 2, as in this case, it's almost always a guaranteed win, assuming that the other side does not have a passed pawn, just like here. Amazingly, however, because of the unfortunate position of the black king, it is white who is winning. Can you imagine? Being 2 pawns down, it is white who is winning. Try to figure out the solution. It's not terribly hard. I bet you can do it. In fact, white is ready to give checkmate in 3 moves. First move is king c5, giving black only one choice. Again, black's problem is that they have to make a move. They have no option to say I pass. So the pawn has to move. White king moves to c4, and again the black pawn has no choice but has to move, and then here comes the checkmate. Beautiful, beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And now let's move on to some other positions that have a whole lot more pieces on the board. And in fact, have occurred in absolutely real games. Here is our first example that was played by former world champion Emanuel Lasker against Taylor. In this position, black's advantage is quite obvious, with the black queen being on f2, attacking the pawn on b2, the white king being kind of in a cramped position, the white queen needing to defend the knight and some other key squares not to get checkmate, and the d4 pawn. So it's quite clear that black is ahead. Yet in this position, black has a move that kind of puts white in even much further trouble. And Lasker here played a5, taking away the only reasonable move white had at hand, playing b4. Now, if the white queen moves away, then the white knight would be hanging. If the white knight moves away, then the pawn on d4 and then on the follow-up c5 would be hanging. If the h-pawn moves, the g3 pawn would be hanging. Of course, if the g-pawn moves, black would just capture it, and the same would be the problem moving the d or the b pawns as well. White in the game continued by playing b4, giving up the pawn, followed by b3, and now black just made another waiting move with the king, king h6, and now, for the same reasons, white is in Zugzwang again. They move any piece, they lose further material. Quite amazing. It does not happen too often with this many or more pieces, but when it happens, it's really quite amazing. And the next example we have is one from Bobby Fischer that he played against Rossetto in 1959. In this position, just like in the previous one, it's quite clear that white is ahead. White has an important and very strong advanced passed pawn on c7, yet it's not quite obvious how white is making progress. In this position, if it's white to move, the white bishop cannot move to e6 because the black knight for now is guarding that square. Neither would rook b8 be a good idea, because then the black rook would capture the white pawn. However, Fischer here simply played a waiting move, a quiet waiting move. Played g4, black captured, white captured back. And now, sadly for black, they are in Zugzwang. Why? Because if the rook moves, that would allow the promotion of the pawn with a check. All of a sudden, black got a discovered check. After g4, pawn takes, pawn takes. Now, if the black knight moves, that would give up the control of the e6 square, and the white bishop would appear there, chasing the rook away from c8. And finally, last but not least, if black moves his king, regardless where, then white is ready to play rook b8, because now, after rook takes pawn, white wins a knight. What a beautiful example. And finally, a very famous old example played by Nimzowitsch with black versus Zemisch. Quite amazing that in a position that's almost full of pieces on the entire board, black can make a simple waiting move, such as h6, and put white in a complete Zugzwang. It's not hard to recognize that if the white bishop moves, the only free square to move to would be to c1. That would hang the knight on b1. If white would move the rook away, black would play rook e2 and trap the queen. If after h6, white moves the bishop to f1, it could be either just captured or the queen would be trapped. So as you can see, pretty much any move white picks, king h1 to a2, the problem would be stepping into a pin, and black would simply play rook f5 to f3, again trapping the queen. As we can see, the white queen has no safe moves either, and neither does the other white rook. Quite a sad story for white, and therefore white resigned. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you got a better idea of what Zugzwang is in chess, and keep it in mind, it's especially common in endgames and in pawn endgames of all. Thank you, and hope to have you back next week. In the meantime, if you're playing games on WCL, I suggest you send me some games, and maybe I'll pick one of your games to analyze on WCL. So long. Bye-bye.